So let me start by just telling you a little bit about myself. I'm originally from West Virginia. Got my degrees at West Virginia University, my undergraduate degree. I did my graduate work at UNC Chapel Hill. So I was in North Carolina even, at a much earlier point in my life. I spent a couple of years in California, and then I started here at UNCW in 2007. So now I'm getting up there in the number of years that I've been teaching here, and I'm an organic chemist by training, and so I'll give time for questions at the end. You're welcome to stop me in the middle. There is a flow to it, but if we stop and talk, I've got no problem at all. I tried to make this pretty heavy on the science, and so I hope that from this presentation, you'll get a sense of what I see when I look at a living system, and which is, and maybe give you an appreciation for the complexity and the awe that we should have when we look at that, and what that might mean about where life actually came from, right? And so, if we go back in history, like written history, history from drawings of cultures before us, I think this is a question of where did things come from that every sort of people group before us has thought about, all right? And what I give here are some sort of key phrases, and in this room, some of these make more sense than if I were to show this to the general population, but they're roughly from the sort of one extreme at the top to a different extreme at the bottom. And there's sort of I don't think, most folks probably slide between these ideas, okay? But at the top, you have this idea that God created, and God created as we have written down for us in a biblical text we attribute to God, right? So for those of us who identify as Christian, we would point, and if someone identifies as a Jewish, right, they would point to the creation story. But a lot of other people groups have creation stories. They may not track exactly with what we read in Genesis, but they're quite close. This idea that God created in some amount of time. The time is really the issue from here down to even here, right? So the extreme would be we read Genesis, and Genesis says to us, it sets out 6 days, right? 6 days of creation, and then on the seventh day God rested. So that's sort of the literal version. And then over time, even Christians, people who read that, and again, before that, even I think Jewish scholars, they read that and then they may struggle with, is that really literal? Do we really read that as days, or do those days mean something different in the original text? Which, right, it depends on, you have various folks who will attribute that original text to different authors. We don't exactly know for sure who wrote the Genesis text originally. Okay, and so then you get these things like gap theory, which is where we're going to turn those days into periods of time, or maybe there are times missing, right? So sometimes you get Genesis 1, and then God created heaven and the earth, and then people will put a gap in there of time where evolution ideas happened. Then as you get down here, folks will become more comfortable with evolution. And then all the way down at the bottom, you get this sort of, what I would term I use sort of molecule to man, but this idea that nature just came about on its own, which is weird, right? How, right? And so there are scientists who try to explain that. And there's some, I think some valid ideas in what they're trying to explain, but this all really hinges on life, right? Where did life come from? The first living thing, even if it was a single cell thing, where did we get, how do we get that life to come about? Okay, so to think about this idea, where did everything come from, let's think about a house. I just pick anything you would build, right? So if I said I want to build a house, okay, I would need some plans, right? Hopefully. I mean, I guess I could just sort of like whip it together, like I could imagine it. But I've imagined it, right? Like a builder would have imagined it. A good builder, draws up blueprints. And then you need supplies, right? So you need all the things that would go into a house. I don't know if you've ever been a part of maybe your parents built a house, or maybe you build, I don't know. But you got to have a foundation of some sort that's firm, and then you usually wood and nails and screws and sheetrock and all the things, paint, those types of things. Now, no one believes that if you took all of that stuff and you stacked it out in the field, that the house will appear. Unless you do the things I said to start with. If you have a blueprint and then you find some folks to follow the blueprint, right, then you get the house. But minus the blueprint, and again, maybe you don't even necessarily need a blueprint, but you certainly need work. You got to have somebody to do that, right? But this is almost like if you think about a true evolutionary picture, this is what is being said, right? That like the thing just, life, the living cell came to be. Now, that may initially sound like, well, maybe I can believe that. And actually, if you go back in history, I won't talk much about, a lot of evolutionary theory traces, at least in part, traces back to Darwin's contribution, but there were people thinking about this before Darwin. At the time of Darwin, it was actually thought that life could generate from nothing. Like the belief actually existed at that time that life could just appear, because they would, you have a piece of meat and then over time, like things crawl out of the meat. And so like, did life appear from the dead meat, right? And there's a chemist who actually tried to disprove this about the time of Darwin. And so, so it's not at the time, there wasn't a completely crazy idea. But now I would argue that what we know about biochemistry, organic chemistry, what I'm talking about today, that's a really hard thing to think about. And that's what I hope you can get out of what I'm going to say. Okay, so some of you are science-minded, some of you are not, so bear with me, but I will try to give you a framework to think about all the things I'm going to talk about. This is not a great image, but I like this image because it talks about all the parts of the cell. It's not, and this doesn't even encompass all the parts, so I'm going to go through more of those, okay? So this, again, historically, we just thought this was a blob. We now understand this to be a machine, really, right? Like a really compartmentalized machine that has very, very complicated chemistries happening all at once inside the cell to cause the cell to be alive and to replicate. So here are some of the molecules around the side, and I'll tell you what these sort of little, these little balls are atoms, but we'll talk a little bit more of that. But you need DNA, you need fats, you need proteins, you need sugars, you need amino acids. That's also a sugar. So you need all these things, okay? And so in order to understand all of these, and some of you may have had a little bit of chemistry, but I'm going to teach you some chemistry, because I've got to teach you a little bit of chemistry to help you piece together the complexity as we're going to build. We're going to build from atom, we're going to build all the way up. Okay, so if you look, this is maybe hard to see in the back, but this is a chart showing like the, if you look at all the molecules that we know about, as the bar goes higher, that atom is included in the molecule. So what you basically see are the most abundant atoms in molecules are carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and it makes sense because living systems are built up of all these atoms. We also have sulfurs, sometimes some halogens, not really so much, phosphorus, and some metals, a few metals in there. Okay, so let's focus on carbon, because basically all of life, water is involved, no carbon in water, but everything else pretty much has carbon, minus some salts that we need. Okay. All right, now you'll see some pictures that I'm going to talk about today, and it's important to talk a little bit about the images you see. So we teach this in general chemistry, and so if you had general chemistry, hopefully you got a little bit of this, right? But this is a molecular formula, right? And so we can talk about how many atoms a molecule has, so that's just the molecular formula. And then those atoms are connected in a certain way. That connection matters, right? So this is a simple one, methane, right? Turns out methane is not flat like this. Methane has three-dimensional structure. That's actually going to come into play, okay? This is what we call a tetrahedron. So not all carbons, most carbons, the ones I'm going to point out, have that tetrahedral structure, okay? And so that's all well and good with methane. But what happens when you get to a more complex molecule? Now, you might look at that and say, that's just a bunch of gobbledygook, right? That's not. That's the actual Lewis structure of cholesterol, right? And so I'm an organic chemist. I have to draw these things sometimes. I don't want to draw that. I never want to have to draw that. I drew that for your sake to see it. Organic chemists don't draw like that. So we use a different style that we call in organic chemistry skeletal form. So if you just look at what's happened here, all the carbons are gone. All the hydrogens are gone except for I've drawn some very specific hydrogens because of these wedges and dashes. You don't have to really worry about that just yet. We always draw in the non-carbon atoms. But basically, we just condense it down to these lines. We also call this a line bond drawing. So what did I say? I just show you this because you're going to see structures that look like this. So when we talk about biochemistry and biomolecules, this is the representation we always use. Okay? So it's a bit for me I want to help you understand this as best I can, but also the complexity, right? So you go from 1 carbon to 27 carbons, things are complex. And it's more complex than I can help you understand right now, because these wedges and dashes also mean something that are very specific to this molecule. So this molecule, cholesterol, has exactly that structure. And it used to be like the definition of organic chemistry came out of the idea that was originally defined by molecules that came from living things. So like organic chemistry was originally defined by life. And over time, that kind of changed to sort of more about the chemistry of carbon, because what we realized is like chemists have learned we can build this. Now, living systems can build that way better than we can, but a chemist can actually make that. And so the same thing I can make, in theory, you can find in a cell. Okay? Okay, so this is the story you are taught in like most versions of a science class on where life came from. Okay? So you are taught, most textbooks still cover the Miller experiment. You probably had this, right? I'll talk more about it, but it was from the 1950s. It's been replicated multiple times. I just found an article just the other day talking about another replication of the Miller experiment. And so I'll show you what this is, but this is basically basic building blocks like gases and some sort of energy, which is electrical charge, is what they use, like what would have been lightning on an early Earth, if this is the way things happen. Then the Miller experiment only produces a few of these, okay, and then you've got to get to bigger versions of these molecules. And then we don't really have a good explanation for this. Scientists, and by the way, scientists study this, so I don't want to diminish what scientists are doing here, because it really becomes okay, they have this belief, now they're going to try to prove it, and they often end up, I think, disproving it. But then from here to the first organism, there are theories of how this could have happened, but there's no evidence. We have zero evidence. No one's ever taken all of these building blocks and out pops a cell. If we want a cell, we need a cell. We got to start with a cell to make a cell. You can't make cells from nothing. We can make DNA. We can have it, pair up into a coil. We can make RNA. We can make proteins. Proteins will fold correctly if they're ordered correctly, but we cannot put them into a cell. We can't make a cell out of those parts. That's just a single cell. then eukaryotes are multi-cell. So in this hypothetical idea of evolution, and by the way, again, this is how most children are taught now in our schools. There had to be some version of this single cell eventually becoming multi-cell, gaining different function, and then that clump of cells then had to become a bunch of different organisms. So this is all driven by what is called random mutation and natural selection. I won't say much about this. I will just say that random mutation almost always causes bad things to happen. Okay? So, you can look that up, but that's true. Like, most random mutations are not good. Okay, so it would be something like this, right? So CO2, and I'll point out, I'll say this on the next slide, oxygen can't be there according to science. I think this has to do with I don't know if it's the belief of what the original mixture was at the time, or that oxygen is highly destructive, it's highly oxidizing. So I'm guessing it just destroys everything. That's part of the problem of having oxygen around for that experiment. Okay, so here's the Miller experiment. They had this fancy setup. There's also there's more to this, but they had to trap all of their. So they up here is the electrolysis, and then they cooled it into water, and they had to trap it, because if they left it up here, it just gets destroyed. So there's thinking behind this. This isn't necessarily just random lightning striking a pool of water near gases, but that's the best we can do, right? Miller experiment makes amino acids. So let's talk about amino acids. That's glycine. So there I've drawn you don't have to do the little line bond. The carbon is there, right? That's one of our natural amino acids, and this is alanine. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to tell you something that I don't know. Miller may have written about it. We could go back and read that. But any amino acid generated right here would be in two different forms, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But that's usually ignored. That actually matters a whole lot, but that's ignored, okay? So there's the yield, like the yield, we hope for 100% yield as organic chemists. They produce like 2% yield of that. But okay, like if that happens for a long time, over a long period of time, maybe, I don't know. That is way, way, way far away from a living cell, like way away. So a lot of times the argument is Miller's experiment produced molecules in living cells, therefore this is how we got to living cells. There's a huge gap. So that is true, but it's a huge gap that we're skipping. From what I can find, less than half of the natural 20 amino acids have ever been produced by this experiment, right? So ideally, if something like this is happening, you would want to see at a minimum all the natural 20 amino acids, because we know they exist, right? All of our peptides and proteins, the function of a cell is relying on those amino acids. And the article I just read said that a DNA base was produced replicating this. So one of the DNA bases apparently has been, at least one. But then there's so proteins come from amino acids. So that's a different story. We can talk about that. You still need sugars, you need lipids, you need a bunch of other biomolecules not produced by that experiment. Okay, so I alluded to this problem. So what is this problem? This is a problem that generally, like, biology textbooks probably just totally ignore. It's a major problem. I can't ignore it because I'm an organic chemist and I do research on this stuff, so I actually care about it. So this is what I would call the chirality problem. Okay? So we have 20 natural amino acids. All but one are what we call chiral. Now, we didn't even know that this property existed until Louis Pasteur. He's actually the guy who tried to prove that life couldn't spontaneously generate. He had this really cool experiment. He's pasteurization, like this idea of, like, if you heat up milk and then cool it, then it kills all the microorganisms. He discovered this, right? So that's Pasteur. He also, before he ever did, people call him like the father of like microbiology, but before he ever did any of that, he was a chemist. And he actually did this really crazy experiment that we teach in our organic class. He looked under a microscope. I love this experiment. He looked under a microscope at crystals that came from wine. He's French, right? And the crystals, he noticed, were mirror image crystals. So he hand separated under the microscope, which is crazy, right? We spend so much time doing this. And you know, when he did this originally, from what I've read, he started to tell people they didn't believe him. They didn't believe him that he actually did it. So he had to reproduce it, right? He separated, this is not the molecule, this is the amino acid, but he separated the mirror image crystals and then he dissolved them. And what he learned is that if you put plain polarized light, so like think polarized lenses, sunglasses, you can change light with a filter. If you put polarized light through the two solutions, they rotated in opposite directions. So that's what he discovered. Okay, but that concept is chirality, that we didn't know that existed, so he discovered it. I mean, it did exist, we just didn't know it. So what does this mean? That means that two molecules, if you have a carbon that's chiral, two molecules can be mirror images, okay, but they're not the same thing. Now, you may say that's not true. I spend a whole lecture convincing my organic students this is true. But your hands are a good example. That's why you see the hands. And that's what they originally talked about. It's like left hand, right hand version. So your hands are mirror images, but you can't superimpose them. Same concept, but at the molecular level. So 19 of our 20 amino acids are chiral. So what does this mean? Well, it turns out that every protein that functions, that's naturally generated and functions in your body is made up by only the L, or I'll just call it left hand, the L amino acid. So what that means is the Miller experiment produces amino acids, but it produces both the left hand and the right hand. Now, what I haven't told you is that if in most of our natural ways of purifying chemicals, you cannot separate those two molecules. You can't distill them apart. You can't crystallize them apart. It's only when so in Pasteur's case, I told you he separated them. It turns out that molecule, which is called tartaric acid, co-crystallizes as single enantiomer crystals. So that's a very rare situation, but that's how he was able to separate them. I do research on this. I have an expensive instrument with an expensive column to separate teeny tiny amounts of 2 enantiomers. So humans spend a lot of time doing this. By the way, a large number of the drugs that you take are chiral, and the FDA now will produce them only as single enantiomer drugs, because if you have another enantiomer of the drug, it can do all sorts of bad things. Sometimes it doesn't do anything, but it can also do bad things. So even more interesting, I think, so that's interesting enough. So how did we get, so if this all happened naturally, how did we get to only L amino acids? Chemists are thinking about this. There's a type of energy in space that will actually pass through chiral molecules and it destroys one enantiomer. So we know that this can happen in nature, but how do you transpose the energy in space to Earth? I mean, I don't know, asteroid, where'd the asteroid come from? Lots of questions, right? So that's Miller experiment has a problem. I will also note that all sugars that exist, right? So sugars, like sugar you eat, but like sugars that are important for function, the DNA backbone is made of sugars. They're all the opposite enantiomeric form. So for whatever reason, I'm going to attribute, you get the point here, right? I'm attributing it to a higher power, right? Not by chance that we have an L form used for one, a D form, which is a different structure, but it's it's the context of the L and D is this left-hand, right-hand concept that we use. Okay. So we're still at the atomic level. Let's get a little bit bigger. How about that? Okay. So why do we need amino acids? Well, and again, if you've had you wouldn't have to have had a class to know this, but because you hear about this when it comes to health and stuff. But we need amino acids, right? Our bodies need to consume amino acids because we can only make so many of them ourselves. Like our bodies can only make so many of them, and then we put our cells put them together to make peptides, which are smaller fragments. And then when you get to be big enough, you're a protein. And basically, all function is from protein. And proteins. I hope to have time to show you a video. Proteins assist in a lot of other parts of the cellular function, but basically all function is required to have proteins. Okay. Okay. Well, what's a protein? So protein again is if you take two amino acids and you hook them together from the acid. This is the carboxylic, what we call carboxylic acid. This is the acid. This is the amine. You stick them together. You make an amide bond or a peptide bond. And then you do that over and over and over again. So humans can do this. We have a machine over in Veterans, peptide synthesizer. So chemists have figured out how to do this. What's very important about this is, right, I show a glycine and an alanine, and notice the way I hooked it together. I just randomly did this, right? But I hooked a glycine acid to an alanine amine. I could have inverted that, right? I could have hooked the alanine acid to the glycine amine. So the order is vital to function. If you mess up the order, you don't get the proper function. Again, this is where a point mutation is exactly that. A point mutation is where you have one amino acid. Usually the way it happens is the mutation leads to a switch of a different amino acid, but basically the order's messed up. So just one amino acid can cause that much dysfunction in a protein that's like 400 amino acids long. One of them can cause dysfunction in the protein. That's not to mention that these are not the most stable molecules ever. Like they're generated. I mean, you can buy versions of protein powder and all this stuff, right? So, but that's probably either connected to something else or encased. Proteins themselves are not the most stable. They can be sensitive to heat and pH, so they can start to fall apart. Again, you have to have order for function. And so I found this off a website, actually. I was hoping somebody had done this a while ago when I looked this up. This is the probability, that number, 1 in this number, is the probability that you could form a 32 amino acid peptide with the 20 natural amino acids, and you would form it in the right order to have the function that it has. That's the probability of winning the lottery. Right? So right, because in an evolutionary process, you have to get to function. And I mean, like I said, you're uphill battle to build the thing, but then you have to build it in a certain order. Yeah.
How many times is that probability tried? Like, how many times could you enter into the Powerball lottery?
Well, so every time you enter, I guess this number goes up, right? Do you know what I'm saying?
How many times in this world has that probability occurred?
Well, so
I'm not phrasing that correctly.
I guess this is just one protein, and I don't know if there's enough random time. I guess it depends on the rate at which you would produce the protein.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So that's a good question. Like I don't know. Like is it even possible that at a random rate that this could have happened over the millions or billions of years? That's a good question. I'm not sure. But again, this is just getting it right for one protein. And what I'm going to show you is that the proteins interact with one another and they interact with other biomolecules. So and then even if you hit the jackpot, the protein jackpot, then you just have this protein to do some function, but like it doesn't really have a role yet. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? I think this is more about the idea, and this is not. It's not even considering chirality. This is not considering this DL issue. This is just if you had all L amino acids. So we're already up to L amino acids somehow, and then that's the probability. Yeah. I'm not sure. I'd be good. I'd have to figure out how to do that calculation. Like, have we had enough time to even do this? That'd be a good argument one way or the other. So, yeah. Okay, so this is what a protein looks like. So I'm a boring organic chemist. Everything's black and white, and the little structures, right? When I go to a conference, everybody's looking at the structures. This is what biochemists do, and get into the medicine side of things. But it's pretty. But there's a rationale. So it turns out, proteins tend to do alpha helix or beta sheets, and so the helixes are the alpha helix. The beta sheets are these longer lines, I think. I'm not a biochemist.
The beta sheets are the little arrow up top of the green one.
Oh, the arrows. Yeah, these right here, the arrows. Yeah. And so this is a glycoprotein, and this is the ordered sequence. And right over here, that tells you how many. So that's 750 amino acids to make up this protein. This is a vital protein for a cell wall. So this is just one protein, right, have specific function. And usually the proteins have pretty specific function, which is what's crazy. Some of it may be conserved, but then you have, these differences, and it gives it different function. So I know that's kind of crazy looking, but I promise that's all atoms there. We're getting to a larger scale. Okay, and then I've talked about amino acids and peptides and proteins. Then you have to deal with all the other parts of the cell, right? So the function comes from the protein, but where do the proteins come from? Well, the proteins are made inside the cell by other proteins, so that's how it works in the cell. And you need to have information. And of course, one of the questions is where all that information come from. So what do I mean by information? Well, nucleus is where all of the genetic code is, and that genetic code is converted into the protein function. Then we've got compartments, we've got cell walls, we've got usually, I think, peptides or proteins that shuttle molecules in and out. So now let's quickly talk about DNA, because there is information in the protein. Where does that come from? It's stored in our DNA. And so DNA, you guys know the helical structure, classic structure of DNA, but let me show you the actual organic structure just to give you some understanding of that. So we have ordered base pairs, right, that are in a specific order, and that order translates to the peptide or protein. And the structure, let's see, yeah. So the structures look like this. Again, just layering on the complexity. These are the bases for DNA. So notice they have more nitrogen atoms than we've seen before. This is the backbone is a sugar backbone with a phosphate linkage. So there's a phosphorus atom. They pair up in the DNA. The bases pair. So this is known, Watson and Crick's pairing. And then RNA is two of the base. One of the bases is different in the pairing for mRNA. And so this is where I now have a video, because so far I've just talked about the structural piece, but I kind of want to put it all together to show you that this complexity, and again, all of these things supposed in an evolutionary framework where there's no creator, this all came about randomly. So that's the story. And so what I'm going to try to do here is show you, these are some pretty cool videos. I can find where I got them from. I have the references at the end. But I'm going to show you this one. The translation. It's not the best, if it's going to go. Here we go. You may not, I hope that the audio's on. I bet the audio is not on through this. It's good with the audio, but if there's no audio, then we'll just go without. I can. So you can watch the real one online with. Oh, it's not showing. Hold on. Sorry about that. I thought it would show. I'm not the Mac are always fancy. They always show up, right? Yeah, it's going to get it up here. It probably still won't, audio probably still won't play. I don't know, maybe it'll play.
On the little,
Yep,
the little controller for the whole system,
yep.
turn the volume up on the one side.
Yeah, it's pretty far up. I'm thinking for some reason it's not, that's it.
That's the one that always.
Yeah, that's okay. I can do my,
I feel my computer like this.
she had, there's a woman who narrates this, but I'll do the best I can for Elizabeth. This is supposed to be a piece of mRNA. So this is RNA that has, that the DNA has been unraveled and the RNA has been created. And the RNA has gone over, and this is a protein, okay? It's actually two proteins, because they show this in a second. And that protein is reading the RNA, and it's generating this new protein, okay? And so this goes through the different pieces, but you'll see it come here. So this is a two-part protein, so there's two pieces that wrap around the mRNA. And then these are called codons. So there's a three base pair reading that corresponds to an amino acid. And the crazy part about this to me is, and these things floating around, this is a tRNA, and the little red bits on the end, that's the amino acid. So you've got this little bitty amino acid attached to these tRNAs. And so what you see is there are three, it slides across, and she talks about this in the video, but there are three different sites to this thing. So it wants to make sure that the protein is in the correct order. And so as the tRNA comes in, it reads it, and if it's the right one, it moves it over to do the chemistry, and then it spits it off to be recycled, right? Again, this is all information, right? There's information in the mRNA that came from the DNA, and this is happening in a different part. This has come out of the nucleus to do protein synthesis. So these are the three sites, and that's what it's saying is basically it reads, because if it's the wrong amino acid, wrong tRNA, it'll spit back off, and it'll wait until the correct one comes down.
So is this what the process would look like in like the original cells, or would this be more of a video talking about like a modern cell?
This would be a modern cell. Yeah, yeah. So you know, would this machinery exist? So that's the challenge. Like, what comes first? And actually, scientists have this argument too. Like, what piece of this machinery would start some type of process that it's talking to one another, right? Right. I mean, that it's just quite fascinating to see it in real life. And you can see the website here, and I probably have it somewhere else if you want it. But there's another video that does transcription, and then there's another one for the one for DNA replication is pretty phenomenal too, because the DNA's helical, right? There's two strands, and so the machinery has to peel those apart and copy them differently. So it's just to see it in real life is pretty phenomenal. Okay, so just to wrap up, because I think I've gone complex enough, but just want to point you out that we haven't even talked about the cell wall, right? So the cell wall. I mean, if you have a cancer cell, you want to lyse that thing open. You want to bust the cell wall or stop it to send it into some type of cell death mode. So these cell walls, now these are pieces. The cell walls, we can sort of mimic this in the lab. So these self-assemble, but they're made up of all these parts. And these parts my main point, these parts had to come from somewhere. So in order to have a cell wall, you need some type of phospholipid, which is here, and I'll show you the structure of that. All functional cell walls in a current cell has cholesterol in it. And then you end up with these, so these are lipids. You get proteins, that glycoprotein, the protein I showed you. It sits in the middle of the cell wall, and they act as pores, and they can shuttle molecules through the cell wall, because the cell wall has to hold everything in, but yet you need molecules to go in and out, right? So it's almost like an engineering feat when you think about it. So this is a phospholipid, right? So these are carbon atoms. The black atoms are carbons. The blues are hydrogens. And then there's oxygens here. You've got a phosphorus head group that has some other polar group, nitrogen in that case. That's the structure. We already saw the structure of cholesterol, right? So that's a different form of the same molecule I showed you before. And then we need a bunch of sugars of different size and shape. So this is a standard, it's a carbohydrate where you see the 6-membered ring. So there's 6 atoms in that little ring. The ones for DNA are in a 5-membered ring. So this sugar molecule is, I would say, very well designed to have different forms. There's a bunch of alcohols on there, and they can make different shapes, basically. That's what we generally see for these molecules. It's a lot about the shape that they can form. So I would argue that based on the complexity and the complexity and yet precision that's needed for life to exist and life to survive and produce function, that this is really a created system. From the basic building blocks up to the more complex building blocks, I think the probability that these molecules came to exist on their own is non-existent, in my opinion, but very small at the best. Yeah.
How much time would you need for it to be possible? And then how much time more would you need for it to be probable?
Well, and we're getting to, okay, so this is why evolution wants to talk about millions and billions of years, because they need time, right? If I believe that God did this in some finite amount of time, then that's it. I've got a creator who has the sort of ability to do this in a set amount of time. Evolution needs long periods of time. I mean, we haven't even talked about the idea of one species to another, right? That type of thing has not been observed, and is only, you would need large amounts of time for these changes to happen. I mean, sometimes it's talked about as an instantaneous change that happened in these sort of, creatures that had change of function. But I don't know the exact amount of time, right? But based on what I've told you tonight, I think you need a very large amount of time to start to have the time to build up complexity. But then if that complexity is building up, what's the driving force for that complexity to stay around to do anything? I don't know the answer to that. A lot of times I will hear my colleagues attribute some type of created power to nature, right? And that's the piece that I'm like, well, we are kind of attributing a creative force here. So I didn't answer your question, but I don't know the exact amount of time.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just personally think, and while this could, I think science demonstrates this, and mind you, I'm in a chemistry department. There's several of my colleagues who would identify as Christian, but in a lot of chemistry departments, you'd find very few, if none, who would say that. I have good friends who I'm very good friends with who would fully be atheist. I don't think they would say there's any kind of higher being, and we've talked about this occasionally. But really, it's a personal decision here, and I think there are some theological implications, and that's really where I want to end, because as much as it's like when I see folks present, I often will see. I mean, I just sit back and I'm like, I'm awed by the creation. They're baffled by why the creation doesn't do what they thought it was going to do. And it's because their story tells them it should be doing something different. And the story I'm thinking about sort of explains it. And I've had this happen to me many, 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 many times. Like, oh, like that's a creation story explains that, but evolution doesn't explain that. So I like this graph because I didn't find this graph until, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something like that. And it's a pretty simple graph. So the idea is that if someone believes that there is a creator, and they have some writings that we attribute to that creator. So for me as a Christian, I identify, the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, and the New Testament. So I would say all of it, I believe all of it is coming from God, has been given to us by God. But then I also believe God created. So we have two things that are separate, right? Like we have writings that we think are important, and we have the creation itself, which I think is important. God created both of those or inspired the creation of both of those. I believe that. But we still have to interpret both of them, right? And so on the right, that's basically what science is. Science is interpreting nature. And there's a little more to that, because it's not just interpretation, because then sometimes it's like doing things to try to understand it. So it's like probing nature. We may not have quite the probing feature here, but certainly we have to understand Scripture in the original context in which it was written. And I believe, we are, sinful, fallen. I mean, we're in a world that is impacted by sin. So there's a piece to that where we have to be careful here about how we interpret. But if I believe these things, then the theology I have and the science that I think about should tell me the same answer. Right? And really, for me, this is where, when in the end of all of this, I still identify as a pretty sort of straight creationist. I'm not going to be super rigorous about it. Sometimes I'll have those. I study Scripture. I'll try to have some of those theological arguments. Those can be useful to have. But that's more about my theology than it is about science, really, for me. Like, my theology has led me to think that there's no reason for me to believe God didn't create it in 6 days, and He created it the way He wanted it, and He created it all such that somehow, and this is a piece that's challenging, but like I also believe that there was some event where mankind was separated from God. So like somehow He created it all perfect, and then things went awry when humans made a decision, but He had built in the ability for all things to do that. Like, that's fascinating to me that God had the foreknowledge to do that, but that's what I believe. And it gives me an appreciation for what I do. I mean, again, I just have a different view of science, and it just gives me some awe. And these are just some verses. There are different verses here, but these sort of talk about, in particular, I think one thing for me as a follower of Jesus, like Jesus pretty clearly pointed to Genesis. He quoted from Genesis, and He had no problem with the people who existed in Genesis. So if why wouldn't, like, it seems like that's maybe been something that Jesus would have like inferred to us, that maybe would have been written down. I don't know. Maybe not. It's not a science book. The Scriptures aren't, I don't believe it's a science book, but I do believe that there are hints in there, and Jesus seemed to be fine with the way Genesis was written. So He's fine with it. I should be fine with it. That's my view. And then, I think the other things about this is, sin. There was a significant change, like the decay we see in the world started at that moment in Genesis, whenever that was. That's what I believe about that. And then I think that we, science doesn't want to talk about Noah and the ark and what the world was like before Noah, right? Because it screws up all of science's beliefs. So that's another one that, like, I just have to be like, well, okay, science don't want to talk about Noah, but if Noah's story is real and it happens in the order I read, that jumbles up some of what science understands. I have to be okay. I'm just okay. I've come to be okay with that. I wasn't always okay with it. I had a guy once ask me, like, were there dinosaurs on the ark? And I was like, why are you asking me that? The guy in my church, like, why are you asking me that? But he helped me tremendously to critically think about these
There
things.
are some artifacts that are from other folks around the world that are not Christian documents that were pointing to like a global flood around the same
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
So even though it's like one of the oldest documents, so it's from Iraq, and it was from like 17 BC, and it claimed the same like global flood or
Yeah.
big flood. So it doesn't have to be I don't know, right versus wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, but scientists won't talk about, like scientists delete that, right? There's no way that type of thing could have happened, right? Because, and again, there's nuance in there. If it was global, was it really global? Did it really go all the way to the top of the mountains or not? So.
Well, that too, like ice age changes, so like more geological scale occurrences, like okay, if it's this big flood, well maybe it's because the ice ages were just finishing and now we have floods.
Yeah. So there's nuance about that, but I think that those types of things are good to talk about and try to understand. But I don't think they. I used to not think about this at all, and then I went to the side, and I used to say, like when I was growing up, I was raised in a Christian home, but like I was like, okay, I got into science, and everybody said evolution is right, and I'm like, all right, fine, like I'll just squeeze it into the Bible, no problem. And then a friend of mine was like, oh really? You think you're going to do that? And he walked me through and like asked me to read and think about some things, and I was like, oh, okay. And so what I've become more comfortable thinking about a creation story in a shorter time frame, which is outside of what science will tell me. But we would have to have different conversations about the evidence that exists in, because all the evidence is the same. Like there's nobody who was there when all these things happened. I mean, unless if I believe in a God and if I believe Jesus is who he said he is, I think he was there, I think God was there, that's it. Right? That's why I put more weight on what Jesus said about it than what I understand about it. Because all the bones in the ground, same bones that we all have to think about. Right? Yeah?
How long do you believe this?
Well, like that's a good question. So there's an actually I don't know who this was. There are theologians who in the past had written. Okay, so let me start over. If you just follow the Old Testament, if you just follow the 6 days of creation, and then you assume that the lineages, bless you, the lineages that we have after the fall, like you start with Adam, and Adam's real, and then you have the lineages which are in, this is in Luke 3, right? It's a lineage all the way back to Adam, I think, right? You do those calculations, and these were, I think they were as a Catholic priest, I think, who did these calculations. You get to somewhere between ballpark 10,000 years, 6,000 to 10,000 years. So that's what a creation story where you're just believing Scripture and you're excluding any scientific evidence. You're just following the lineage. Yeah. Science has ways in which they're calculating those long years, and I struggle with some of these because of distant light traveling to Earth and measurements of how long it would take for that to happen, that type of stuff. But I will say one thing to note: carbon dating only goes back about 100,000, 150,000 years is all carbon dating will get us. So to get to longer times, you need different atoms. But the carbon dating that we hear about for dating items has a shorter time period because of the decay rate of
How
carbon.
do we know how much carbon existed at that?
Oh, so like
It's the carbon dating is, and these are the good questions to ask. Like, where does carbon dating fall in this? So to date carbon, you need to know when carbon 14 is no longer being introduced into whatever it is. So that's why you're measuring carbon 14 and you're dating backwards to where the maximum carbon 14 would have been. So when something dies, it stops taking in food and it doesn't take in any more carbon-14. So that's the answer. You need to know like what you're dealing with before you're dating it, right? You know, because carbon-14 is usually used for dating things that were living, and so the point at which it stopped consuming carbon is when it died, right? That's the 0 point,
And
right?
so like the other thing I think is carbon 14 is like 0.1 to the 14, right?
It's a very small amount, yeah.
Tiny amount, but
Yep.
it's all carbon has a really tiny amount of it, that's carbon 14. And so then once you're dead, you stop taking in that carbon 14 and you're going backwards. Like if I'm 100 grams, I'm clearly not 100 grams, but like 10 to the minus, 10 to the minus 12 of me is carbon 14. And then I would backtrack from there. All right, I know I'm 10 to the minus 30. I'm getting smaller and smaller amounts of carbon.
Yeah.
Is that,
Yeah, this is that's why there's a limit, because we can only measure to a certain precision because it's such a small amount. I mean, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
And then another part that I think is interesting that would play into like the cells actually forming is the fact that mitochondria aren't like can completely just break off from our cells, but they choose to stay in us because they're prokaryotics in general. So at some point, like yes, they were added in, so there's like the evolution half of that possibly, but then there's still how our cells even formed in the first place because everyone says, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Well, at some point it had to enter and be a part of it too.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Biochemist talking there.
What do these passages from the Bible say about evolution and about there being a creator?
I pulled some of these because these don't per se talk about a creator. These are Jesus talking about Genesis, like referencing Genesis. I pulled Genesis 3 to talk about sin, and so several of these are about the idea that death came after sin. So this is one of the other points when folks talk about like if you have another, and again, Christians are spread across this range. And again, I used to be like, I believed in the Bible and what it said. I don't know if I would have said it was totally inspired at that point, but then I used to cram evolution into Genesis. And so the problem we have with that is multiple places in scriptures, and that's what some of these are talking about, identifies like the point of sin as what causes death to come into existence. So the problem with that is that's Genesis 3. And the creation story happened before that. So you need evolution to be happening before Genesis 3, right? Some would argue that these references in Paul's writings indicate that that's when death originated. Hence the idea that, and again, that's an interpretation of Paul's writings about whether one believes that he means that's the first time it ever came to be, because that would start to refute the idea of death before. Right? Because in a creative story, there's no death before Genesis 3 in a creation story. An evolutionary story, you've got to have death. You had to have had organisms that came to be and died before Genesis 3. There's also, I think I have this one written down. I like 125, so I can read that one. I think it's NLT. I like this one because to me, this is the thing we risk as all humans. 125 says, they traded the truth about God for a lie, so they worshipped and served the things God created instead of the Creator Himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. To me, that means like we can worship any other thing, including the creation itself, if we're not careful. So that's what I put that one there for. So.
Can I offer a secondary interpretation to the passage from Romans 5?
Sure.
Where it
Yeah.
says, Paul says, death came through sin.
Yeah, sure.
You have verse 21 up there. It says, so that as sin reigned in death, grace also must reign through righteousness, leading to eternal life. So it seems like he's saying that sin brings about death, just in the sense that grace brings about righteousness, but not necessarily that one precedes the other.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
In like a historical sense. So it seems that Paul is not making a historical claim, but rather a theological claim about the dangers of sin.
Yeah, that's fair.
Rather than where physical death originated.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, no, I agree with what you're saying. I think that's a fair interpretation. Let me see. I have that one written down. I just want to read it. So, yeah. Yeah, I think 12 probably is more. So 12 is maybe a little more of the indication that death, sort of, the result of sin is death. Right? So when Adam sinned and sin entered the world, Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. That could also be in relating the idea that sin results in death and not that it was the absolute start of death. But these are some of the passages folks will use, because you'll get some rigorous folks saying absolutely, like, it had to be creation. And I mean, there are some folks really far there who say things that I certainly don't agree with about somehow that being tied to someone's salvation, and I don't believe that. But people say those types of things. Which yes, there you go, yes. Yeah. And Ken Ham has some interesting stuff. I don't want to totally knock Ken Ham. You can look up Ken Ham. But Ken's pretty like explicit, like, you got to believe this way or else. No, I don't believe that. So.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, Tom.
So your colleagues that don't believe in a designer, they are leaning on enough time?
Yeah. I think they just don't think. I think it's become, right, so you all probably know the history, and I don't know this history very well, but right, like, evolution wasn't really taught in the sort of public system and people thought about it, and scientists thought about it before it was taught, but like the Scopes trials in the 1920s, and people point to that for the time when we started to teach it. That's from what Darwin, you're like 60 years from Darwin, 50 years from Darwin. And so folks were already thinking this way. Though I tried to read the Origin of Species. Whew, I did not read the whole thing. But there are passages in there where Darwin himself kind of, I feel like his writings themselves point to the question about whether or not there could be a creator. Like, I don't think he was explicitly as sort of atheist as people point to him as being. But yeah, my colleagues just don't think about it. And if they're pushed to think about it, I think that's what they would say, right? Like, oh, well, no, this was just, we know this is the way it was. It was time and, lightning and brew. And they just talk about this randomly. They don't. That's why I like. Thanks for the chance to give this type of talk, because a lot of scientists never think this chemically about all that stuff that had to happen before we get a cell. A lot of times it's just whoop, and then we're to the cell, and then that makes sense, Tom?
This whole thing is an amazing also first, but this whole thing reminds me of a quote that I read in Angels and Demons. It's like the book Angels and Demons by Dan Brown, right? It's not really about Christianity, but at one point the scientist that ends up dying is inspired by a quote. It's inspired me as a quote of, "We study science to look at the world through the eyes of the creator." And I think that this idea is being able to look very, why would you study science? Is to be able to look at all the intricacies of this like beautifully designed system and to appreciate it in a different, in a light where we maybe otherwise would just take it for granted. So I just think that that's like maybe like a pitch talk for science, but also how you can relate your science to your kind of more spiritual understanding of the world as well.
Yeah. Well, as you and I were talking about briefly before, like most folks can look at the sunset, sunrise, like macro level, we see the beauty. Yeah. Like to me, I see it at the microscopic level, but like most people don't think about the microscopic level, and that's fine, right? That's my world. So yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think that the evolutionary theory gained so much traction when there are so many like kind of question marks and like unanswered questions?
I don't know. I haven't really studied the history to speak to that directly. Darwin had an interesting story, right? If we just point back to him, because a lot of people will point to Darwin, right, as a person who sort of gave some rationale to the ideas that became evolution, really. All right. So this idea of natural selection, which as a Christian, I have no problem with the ideas of natural selection. That, like, if you put an organism in a certain set of environmental situations, or you look at genetics, that these outcomes will come about. I think it's totally valid, right? It's just they extrapolate that further back to this idea that this is the driving force for those things to come to be. And I would just say differently than that. No, I think it's just designed into like God created the animal to be that way. And if you put pressures on it, there's enough genetic code there to adapt to the adjustment, right? I don't know if it was people who were non-believers just continuing to build a story. I mean, I could get super theological. I don't want to be weird about it, but I believe that there are forces around us that God fights against. So maybe they were involved. I mean, it's a wonderful way to draw people away from God, is it not? To give them an alternative. I don't know. That's the more like outside the box version. But it'd be an interesting history. Maybe there's a history book out there that would explain that. I just don't know it off the top of my head. So. Yeah, there was. Oh, okay.
Also, an answer to that would definitely be like people like to physically see something to understand. Many people don't believe in ghosts and X, Y, and Z, and so like when you give them a physical thing to grasp onto, that's a lot more easy to understand than the idea that there is something out there that you're not really allowed to understand. And so people would just grasp at something that is physical rather than just accepting that it's not all the answers fed to you.
And then also like if energy cannot be like created or destroyed,
It's like there's lightning. Like,
Well,
think about the
you got to consider, like my lightning example had to presuppose that there was a ball of matter here that we call Earth, right? So like before that, there had to be, the Big Bang, like all of matter in one infinitesimally small, like, and then that explosion. Which, if that were true, certainly if you can imagine compressing all of the matter in the world, all of the universe into a single point, a lot of energy there involved. And so the explosion in creation, that would get us to something like what we have here, right? Where you would have to have these starting basic elements, right? Which are the gases that they talk about. Yeah. That's probably not very good. Yeah?
I have a question, but I can't want to speak to her.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, but I can't want to speak to her.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, it's fine.
How evolution gained traction.
Yeah.
I don't know how in the past 100 years, but just in the beginning, like when Darwin first kind of published his Origin of Species, it was just because it was a plausible theory at the time. Like, it wasn't like when it came out, say all the Christians over here were like, we hate that, and all the secular humanists over here were like, yes. It was actually like way more mixed.
I believe that, yeah.
So some of the like head scientists studying evolution were like priests. It's much more mixed reaction. It wasn't just like the Earth, because also the young Earth interpretation has not been the dominant view throughout history, and so it wasn't like Christians like when Darwin published his Origin of Species, were like the Earth was only made in 7,000 years, so it couldn't be possible. That wasn't necessarily the dominant interpretation. So at the time, it was just religiously and also just scientifically plausible. But back then, like you said, we also thought cellular laws.
Yep, we had much less understanding of anything at the cellular level.
Now,
So.
why in the past 100 years or so, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I had a question for you. Do you think it's plausible that you could have a creator getting all this started and then letting it run its course?
Yeah.
The really hard thing is like, how do you
Yeah.
get into the beginning?
Yeah, no, I think the piece that the piece that evolution, in my view, has the hardest issue with is life, is the creation of life. Like, so if that's what you're referring to, getting things started, creation of life. Now, I still think that the idea of some even just take, I don't care what you have, but taking some organism and trying to get another organism, I think there's a massive chemical problem with that too. But, so it depends on what you're talking about God creating. But then we start to sound a whole lot like the creation story, right? If God created the animals individually, and then we're talking about from there, but that, of course, evolution doesn't believe that. But that I could get on board with, right? Like maybe, now, I also think humans from animals is, that's a necessary piece to evolution. That, I think there are fossils that we have that are questionable of like what, like the creation of a Homo sapiens is something that an organism that stood upright. But I think it's a longer conversation, but I think there's problems with just organism to organism evolution as well. So, yeah.
Do you think that there's more scientific evidence across various disciplines, from geology to cosmology? Do you think there's more evidence for an older Earth, that being billions of years, or a younger Earth, thousands or tens of thousands?
I think that science has self-selected a large amount of data that tells themselves what they want to hear, which is that you have a lot of evidence for a very old Earth. And when they find evidence of a young Earth, they exclude it, or they get rid of it, or they ignore it, or they explain it away. And then I'll read articles where they find things that don't make sense in the evolutionary timescale. And they're like, that doesn't make sense. That must be an anomaly. So that's my view of it, because I think I started this story earlier. I had read a story where there were these theologians who used to argue against the creation story because they didn't think that God needed 6 days. They thought he could just do it instantaneously. So they were arguing the other direction, right? Like, no, God didn't create in 6 days. He just created everything instantaneously. So, yeah, you can kind of slide either way. But, yeah.
So to kind of ask a follow-up, if we were to examine all the evidence, if none of it was discarded, do you think there's more evidence for an older Earth or a younger Earth?
I think I'm biased because I've changed my views, but I think there's a whole lot of evidence when you look at it for a young Earth. I think the one that I love the most is, why do we not have any trees that are older than 5,000 years, which would be about the time the Noah's flood occurred? You can look that one up. There's scientifically no trees that we can date to any older than about 5,000 years. Maybe up to 10, but I think it's about 5. So, yeah.
Using the genealogies in Luke 3 and in other instances, it is often reasoned that the flood happened about 4,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so we do have trees that are 4,500 years old, 5,000 years old, I think a little bit older than that as well. And if there was a global flood, these trees would have been destroyed, but there's no evidence that they were. Would you say this is evidence against a global flood, or?
No, I think it's very strong. I mean, we may be off by 500,000 years, okay, from the numbers we just gave, but why are there no 25,000-year-old trees? Why are there no 100,000-year-old trees? Like, evolution should tell me, I think, we should just have older trees. The idea that we're within 1,000 years, that's, to me, points to pretty strong evidence. Like, so maybe the genealogy evidence is not telling the exact story, or, it is actually possible for trees to be submerged underwater and survive. I don't know how long they can survive, but it's amazing I don't know if they've, I feel like I've read evidence of that. Anyway, I could look that up. But I think that, imagine trees that were at the top of a mountain that weren't totally submerged. I mean, and again, this comes, of course, back to the argument about the flood, but I actually think it was a global flood. I mean, that's my view of it from this, like tops of the mountain global flood. So that, yeah, I mean, it's a good argument, right, of like, why isn't the number exact? But I think the timescales are close.
There's also a part of evolution when it comes to plants where they talk about how all the plants were in the water at first, and then they slowly started creeping upon land, and then that's how we got plants on land. So it can completely be that they were out, it got covered by water, and then they started coming back up. But
The production of angiosperms was when the most amount of species of plants actually hit Earth. Which another thing is like horseshoe crabs are older than plants, or like some plants on Earth. So it's like there's some data that's saying that like, yeah, trees are pretty old, but we have some like arachnids that's.
Yeah, but horseshoe crabs would have survived the flood, right? And Noah also. This is why Noah's flood's so problematic for science, right? Because, and in theory, Noah had like all the animals that survived after the flood on the ark. In theory, if you believe that. But he would have had to have dinosaurs on the ark. That's a whole nother story. But that's the truth, right? He would have had to have had some versions of dinosaurs because they would have been there before. We know they existed, right? Dinosaurs existed, and they went extinct. So, I don't know. That one shook me up pretty.
Who says birds didn't de-evolve?
Yeah.
So he had the precursors of all these like dinosaurs or whatever. It's not that he had all the animals we
Yeah.
have now, but it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the precursor dinosaur, the precursor chicken, like whatever. You know.
And they obviously, whatever happened after the. Yeah, whatever happened after the flood, obviously dinosaurs didn't survive, right? They couldn't have survived after the flood because they're not here anymore.
My other thing though is like with the flood, it's like well maybe it was a little bit more regional selective, and that explains maybe some of the like extinction events.
Sure.
Like why did some things survive an extinction event or not others, or like that describes where dinosaurs were there, now they're gone, right? So there could be just more analogous or like metaphorical stories.
No, that's a completely fair. Like people who have more detailed conversations and look at the text, to try to discern how to read the text, but whether or not we were dealing with a complete global flood or
I just want to offer another piece of
some version.
like evidence.
Yeah.
There's like so to make the universe in the physics reality, like in the physical reality that we need, we also have finely tuned parameters and like physical constants of the universe. So there's one that's I forget the name of the constant, but essentially dictates how fast or small the energy is that expands the universe at the rate that we're expanding at. And if it's not this certain constant, it'll either shrink and collapse on itself, or it'll explode and we'll go to the cold death. And we live in just the right, like, fine tuning of all these cosmological constants that exist to support life. So not even just life on Earth, but like the universe itself also has a very divine creator sort of air to it as well,
Yeah.
and that we just have like these random constants fall out of
Yeah.
nowhere. So,
Yeah.
I think that's also like you could think of it as chemistry, or you go even deeper into physics.
How old do you think the Earth is?
The Earth.
Yeah, or like the universe. How old do you think it is?
Well, like I'm not going to be like concrete about it, but I think in a creationist view, like that all happens pretty fast early on, right? Like, so was there a gap between the creation of the land? I mean, we're still talking days, so it seems like God would have been able to create that in days. Now, we do have the issue, and it's a totally valid issue of like, then how do we get distant starlight that's showing up here, right? Because that would have taken like millions of years for light to travel from distance. And people have theories. So again, this is where it's like on the core bits, I'm creationist. I'm not going to go to the mat on this, but I think the argument is that, again, God's creating in this point of time. So he must have, I think a lot of the argument is that he created and spread out the universe, but created the light in between, like somehow created the light in between. And people say, oh, well, you're just hand waving there. And maybe that is just hand waving to try to explain that. Because I think that's one that the distant starlight says more about the potential of an older, that's universe versus like Earth, where, maybe we could talk about Earth being created separately for some reason. So having the universe exist longer and then the Earth created, so.
I mean, but that also honestly has been another point of like the divine creation thing, with all the different ways that you could imagine an Earth to be and it actually happened, the chances of that being small, like having to go through all this effort to make it happen. So why does it, why, I guess, is still pointing to this, like, well, here's this creator doing it, or here's all the necessary pieces of letting the house build itself, so to speak. I just think that having the, like, set amount of time and the set amount of place and everything in the right perfect storm has been, good proof for us.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you've had any opportunities to share your faith in the classroom, and also do you feel like you have the ability to do that at a public university?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I intentionally and explicitly make a statement of faith in my classes, but a couple things I did change. I'm chair right now, so I teach a graduate level organic, so I don't get to teach the sophomore level organic, but when I do teach the organic 1 and 2, I tried. So a lot of the books and a lot of my older language would talk about things evolving. I took that totally out of my language. It doesn't mean I don't believe in a evolutionary type of change. I just took it out of my language, and I try to throw in the ideas around creation. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. To use the times use creator, created. Designed. I just try to throw those words into my language. And then I would say I've had more opportunities just to do things like this or to have one-on-one conversations with students. Yeah. And I'm always, anybody ever wants to talk, my door's always open to talk about it.
As your old student too, that you made a very good point to.
Oh, that's true.
Convey, how intricate and unique it is to have molecules build in a certain way. Even just at that level without a religious affiliation, you can really appreciate how much effort is built in organic molecules. So
Yeah.
even if you don't actually explicitly say design, creator, God, you can still get some wonders out of that as well.
Yeah, I do have to introduce organic chemistry, and I won't use these slides, but I do use, complexity to talk about why it's important to think about it. Yeah.
I do have a question about fairness, or kind of.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I just want to see how you respond to this. So when we talk about needing so much time to get the chemical, all these things to happen.
Sure.
And those who want to evolution is appeal to more and more time. We would consider that ad hoc, right? You're supposing that because you need it for it to work.
I mean, I would say. I think there's other evidence that an evolutionist would point to for the age, but I think they do need the time. Yes, I think they need the time. Yes.
Don't we need, as creationists of whatever sort, whether younger or older, need to avoid also, coming up with ad hoc explanations to dismiss?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that the whole that might even be Ken Ham's work. You can find folks who will explain all the things. And I think there are some things we just don't have. There may be a point, and evolution explains that better than creation. That doesn't mean I have to not believe in creation. It just means that as someone who believes in creation, I don't understand that data point. Yeah, I'm okay with saying that. I mean, as a human, I'm certainly fine with not fully understanding it all. They're still fine to have conversations about it, though. I think that's important to do that. But yes, I agree. You shouldn't just try to squeeze it all in. I think it's okay to say I don't know the answer to that, right? Or that doesn't make sense to me. And I will say, the Institute for Creation Research, which is not Ken Ham, it's another group. They actually do some science to try to prove a younger Earth, but that's and they're self-funded. The federal government is not funding this. If I wrote an article or a paper or grant, the federal government would never give me money if I said I'm going to try to prove that the Earth is younger than we say it is. Even if I was an expert in the field, I'm not. But even if I was, I don't think they would ever fund that. That's just my gut feeling. Because the people reviewing that grant are going to be people in the field. And so they're going to already have like sets of beliefs, and I just don't think they would ever fund it. So there's not a lot of funding to do this type of work where you would sort of try to disprove evolution, let's say that. So, yeah.
Would you say that the theory of evolution has so many question marks that maybe schools should stray away from talking about it as much?
No, I don't think that. I think the challenge. Okay, so my kids go to public school. I'm grateful to have public school. We've had wonderful experience, wonderful teachers. I'm so grateful that they do what they do for the amount of money we pay them to do it. And my kids will learn an evolution story. I just counter that. They come home, I'm like, okay, that's what they're telling you. I'm going to tell you this version of the story. So that's the way I handle it. A broader representation in the public school, maybe, but I just don't think you're ever going to. I'd be real surprised in a public school you're going to get the backing of that idea. I think evolution at this, and it might be, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can reverse it, but I think evolution is just viewed as the common story that everyone ascribes to.
Talking about how evolution gained so much traction, I would say that's one of the reasons why is because the church, rather than engaging with evolution whenever it started to come about, you started to have things like Christian fundamentalism arising in the early 1900s, and it was almost like we need to get away from the wicked world, to let it taint us, rather than engaging with these ideas and presenting a case against them. There was a retreat which allowed those ideas to blossom and to grow, and then finally the church was like, okay, this is becoming harmful, we need to engage, and at that point they were kind of at a disadvantage.
Gotcha.
At that point.
Yeah.
So I think it was their philosophy about how to handle ideas that seemed to be anti-Christian or against the Bible. Rather than engaging them, they wound up ignoring them, which didn't solve the problem at all.
And maybe sort of to your point, even, and I mentioned Pasteur, so I've read more on Pasteur. He's like, I was once told, you're supposed to have as a chemist, you're supposed to have a chemical hero. That's a nerd thing, but I would identify Pasteur. So I've read more about him. So he was identified as a Christian, and in his work on pasteurization and this device he developed to sort of disprove the idea of spontaneous generation, he was working on that. And again, this is from what I read, and this is not from his own writings, I don't think. So this is people telling his story. He was encouraged to avoid that type of research at that time. So I don't know the why, but yeah, like if folks were discouraged over time of not pushing against the alternative, which he was contemporary with Darwin. His experiment was, from what I've read, it was an attempt to push against the ideas of Darwin and evolution. But, we have the one experiment, but he didn't. He went another way and created the whole field of microbiology. And there's crazy stories about him, like understanding that, like, after you do a surgery, the doctor actually has to cleanse himself before he does another surgery, or he passes on disease. Like we didn't know those things in the 1860s, 1870s or something.
Would you?
Yeah, go ahead.
View is a mixture of the two, or like definitely more on the creation side?
No, I think I'm pretty. In most of the aspects, I've just settled on creationism. Again, it's more theological for me. I think there is less published data on this, but I think there are some interesting points, and I tend to find them myself when I read just a science article, right? And they find something random. I think not so long ago, right? There are these dinosaur bones, right? And they drilled into them, and they found like whole blood cells inside this was, and originally I think that they didn't publish it because they're like, that can't be the case, and I think they actually eventually published that. This is this number of years ago. So like I'm like, how's that possible? I don't understand how that, really old bone has a blood cell of some form in it. I don't know.
Is Genesis chapter 1 giving us a historical ordering of the creation events? I.e., was the sun created 3 days after light and 1 day after the earth, 2 days after
Again,
etc.?
an actual literal reading would, and a literal creationist would say yes. I think that could be some of the variation in my mind of like whether or not it's 6,000 or 10,000 or something like that. But I don't think that gets us, there's just no reason for it to be millions of years old. I mean, I sort of am siding with these old scholars who are like, why would God need that? Like if I think that God inspired the writing of that text to read the way it reads, like, why would it not be literal? Like, could it be story and could I be wrong? Yes, I totally could. And I would own up to that someday if I find out that I'm wrong, maybe when God tells me I'm wrong.
So would you say you would think that Genesis chapter 1 is a historical ordering?
Yes.
If somebody asked you,
yeah,
hey,
because it's out of, in the creation order is out of order of evolutionary theory as well. So even the order of, I should know this, but if we look at the order in which God created, it doesn't follow evolutionary order, right?
Would you say that?
I think that's accurate. That's my opinion.
Which one's accurate?
God's version is accurate. Yeah, the biblical version is accurate. Again, evolution needs a certain ordering for their theories to work, and maybe this is God smiling down on us and saying, no, I did it this way because, well, he's God. He can do it that way. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What about like the people
Yeah,
that's in there? Because they're like all the time, like the time scales that people live right after, like in the first chapter.
Oh boy, here we go. Okay, here's my best attempt. I think the ages are real. Again, as you can tell, I'm a pretty literal reader of Scripture, at least in Genesis. I know there are other places where we can't read literally. It's story or allegory, so I understand all that. But I read Genesis literal. So when it comes to the ages in Genesis 6, 9, Genesis 9, we're given ages of all the folks. Noah's 600 years old. Somebody's 900.
The oldest, I can't remember, but the oldest is like 900.
Which he's right before Noah. He would have been alive at the flood. Methuselah, and Adam was in the 900s too. So do I think that's real? Yes. Why do I think that's real? I don't think So if I believe in creation, God created perfect. Like Adam was perfect, and Eve was perfect, and then sin happened, and then something switched. And whether it was them being cast out, but I don't think it's just them being cast out of the garden, because all of creation's broken when man is separated, right? So it's the entire creation that is suffering. So there's something happened, and then from that point on, we've had decay. But Adam is still perfect. Now, he and Eve had kids who must have had, again, if I'm being literal, they must have had kids with like cousins. I don't know. Like you in the very beginning, there's some. You would have to have had crossing of genetics to start to get to more and more humans. But they're all still perfect. Well, Adam and Eve are still perfect. Something switched in them, but as you start to have genetic reproduction, you start to have decay. And so that's one piece. So you're dealing with a perfect human. If we're just talking about Adam or Eve, dealing with perfect human. And number two, I think that the earth was, and this comes from some of the text in Genesis, I think the earth was somehow different. Like Earth was there, but I think the atmosphere was significantly different before the flood. I think that's a valuable understanding because I think that helps us understand why some species don't survive after the flood, because I think they're in a drastically different climate. And it could have been that there were crazy things, right? And we don't have much, but there's some crazy things going on pre-flood, right? Genesis 6 and Sons of Giants and those types of things, right? So like we have some weird things going on. So I don't know. This may come from, again, I've read Ken Ham stuff, so you got to just be careful with what I say because maybe some of it came from Ken and you want to double check what's in. But there is this idea that the earth, there's text in Genesis talks about the earth being basically surrounded by water. So there's some thinking that there was a heavier atmosphere, and that heavier atmosphere, prevented certain diseases. I mean, think about what do we die of, right? We die of our bodies failing, or we die of disease, some type of disease or cancer. So if cancer rates were much less before the flood because of the atmosphere, people could have easily lived a lot longer. Now, it's hard for me to wrap my head around living 900 years. I'm only in my 40s, and I'm having a hard time thinking about 90. I may not make it, but even if I did, so I can't imagine 900. So don't get me thinking that way, but I don't know. So there are folks who have tried to help explain this theologically. A lot of these folks work in theological realms when they do this. There's also the whole point of the days in Genesis. That's a Ken Ham thing. But if you look into it, it's pretty the word used for day is used a lot in the Old Testament, and it, when accompanied by a modifier, always means 24 hours. So I don't know, you can research that yourself, but there is evidence that that's pretty literal.
Wow, yeah. I was just reading Genesis last week, so this is all very fresh, and I was like, oh, that's
Yeah.
a long time.
So I'm always, my office is, I have two offices because I'm chair, but I have my research office in Dobo, and I have an office in Veterans. The Dobo room is 2068. You can find me pretty easy. That's probably the better one to find me in. It depends on the semester, but in the summer, if you happen to be in the summer, that's where you can find me, trying to do research. So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.